Thank you very much, Mike, and thank you for the invitation to come and speak to you all today. As Mike said, I've worked on both sides of the industry for many years. Go back to the previous slide, please, AJ. I've worked in the industry for 52 years, both on the wet and dry sides, as ship's captain, stevedore. And in terms of abandoned cargoes, I used to witness cargoes actually abandoning themselves when I was at sea, as I saw steel coils coming out of the side of containers and dropping into the ocean, which was quite a daunting prospect. But as Peregrine said, our first speaker, there are many different reasons why cargoes do become abandoned. And some of them you wouldn't necessarily think of. Trade sanctions, he did touch upon, geopolitical events which change things. And you could argue that the abandoned bulk cargo of ammonium nitrate in Beirut, which was a real disaster, was such an example. And over 52 years, I've seen many, many examples of where things go wrong, but I'm still having my eyes open by new things that go wrong. And Peregrine mentioned the receiver might go bust, or the receiver might suddenly reject the cargo because it's not up to specification. Things get changed in transit. Bills of ladings can change through many hands during a voyage. Typically, things can go wrong just through poor stock inventory. I used to be a stevedore in the port of Hull in the UK, which is the largest timber importing port in the UK. And there could at any one time be hundreds of packs of timber on the quayside where nobody knew who it belonged to. Some of them were insurance write-offs. Some of it was because of losses and gains in the stock control system, timber being called off incorrectly. And you could tell which was bad because it was going black. The problem with containers, and I know we have abandoned bulk cargoes, as was seen in Beirut, but container cargoes do tend to be abandoned quite regularly. And that can cause a significant problem for terminals, as we shall see, because you can't tell what's inside the container until something goes wrong. Next slide, please, AJ. Here's an example of where cargoes in containers have been on the terminal for much, much longer than they should have been, and something goes wrong, or they're rejected by the receiver for one reason or another. In the top right there, that's molasses, which was in a flexi tank and has leaked inside the container itself. And who's going to pay for that to be cleaned up? On the top left-hand side, that's scrap. And I'll come back to scrap a little bit later on, because that does cause some significant problems. Bottom left, of course, is animal hides. And this was a container where they noticed stuff oozing out from underneath the doors and thought, goodness me, that's not good. And then somebody had the unfortunate job of opening the door and discovered that lot inside. And of course, a big risk with that is anthrax. So who's going to pay for cleaning up that particular abandoned cargo? And why was it abandoned in the first place? And we've looked at some of those reasons. You'll be hearing more later. And the panel discussion will be able to drill in onto some of those things. The bottom right-hand corner, it's cocoa butter, which was in the wrong kind of container in the first place. They noticed after a couple of years, I might add, that the container was starting to bulge. So you do wonder what happened with the demurrage procedures on that particular item. And I would not have wanted to be the person who opened the door in the first place. Next slide, please, AJ. Further examples where things can go wrong. Obviously, the timber inside that consignment from West Africa on the right-hand side was pushed by forklift into the container. How are you supposed to get it out? But clearly the receiver didn't know how to get it out, so they left it in there and just abandoned it. And then you start to get a deteriorating cargo situation, and somebody has to pay for the clear up. Top left is another example of where the cargo was just too difficult to discharge from the container. So the receiver just said, forget it, I'll walk away. And that then becomes a problem for the terminal. And terminals need to have a plan in place for how to deal with this not wanted, but certainly will happen situation. The picture in the middle, which shows granite blocks inside a container with condensation, that was the receiver rejected that particular container because it was supposed to be cocoa, and it turned out to be granite blocks. So it was fraud. Basically, it was fraud. And on the bottom left-hand side, this is just a slight sachet to the left. This was me taking pictures in the terminal, looking at the conditions in the terminal itself. And on this particular terminal, I picked out one, because I've been auditing for many, many years, I picked out one particular tank container which was right adjacent to the railway line on the confluence of a major road roundabout, so in a very exposed position. There was a particularly nasty chemical inside the tank, and the terminal assured me that they had everything in place for stock control. I said, okay, show me what's happening with this particular container. They couldn't find it. They couldn't find it. And when they realized it had been there for 7 years, Now, how can a container be abandoned for 7 years? It prompted that particular terminal operator to do an audit of all its dangerous goods around the world, dangerous goods specifically, and they found that 7 years on a terminal for a container that's been abandoned is not unusual. It actually happens quite a lot of the time. And you think in a modern supply chain, with all the sophisticated systems we have in place, how can that container just become lost? You think about all the people involved in that supply, the shipper, the consignee, the consignor, the receiver, the operator of the container itself. How can it get lost? But these things happen. And when I went to look at their repair shop, this was the view, bottom left, that was in their repair shop. So that led me to believe that the operator of this terminal perhaps doesn't have the most sophisticated systems in place. Next slide, please. This is a specific example. This is an actual shot of a container that was held by the authorities in a port in Italy some years ago. This was a shipment of scrap coming in from the Middle East into a port in Italy. And at the time, the Italian authorities insisted that all shipments of scrap were tested for radioactive sources. And unfortunately, on this occasion, they found one. So in this little container on the left-hand side, the 20-foot, they found about 1 meter from the floor towards the front end of the container, they found an unidentified radioactive source. So that, of course, raised the authorities' alarm. And they insisted that the container was kept on the terminal. They had to put an exclusion zone around it, as you can see there, which is quite a big shock to the terminal when you need the space to move your other cargoes. Incidentally, in Philadelphia, and I was going out for a conference just a couple of years ago to Philadelphia, they had a suspected dirty bomb in the port, and the police put a 2-mile exclusion zone around the terminal, a 2-mile exclusion zone. A similar incident happened in Malta a couple of years ago. 2 miles would wipe out the whole island. You just can't deal with that. So we need to have a plan. So what happened in this particular case is they needed to identify the source of the radiation inside scrap. And I assure you that radiation inside scrap is not an unusual phenomenon. It happens a lot. So the terminal was isolated in this part, and they wondered, what do we do next? We have to find what it is. Is it a dirty bomb? Is it something that will explode? We just don't know. To cut the story short, they had to construct a robot to dismantle the container, actually locate the source. When they eventually found it, it was a medical isotope, an unused medical isotope, which had been tossed out in the scrap and had appeared in this particular cargo. Now that took a year, 12 months to sort out, because there was a long process involved, and it cost eventually over €1 million. So this is an example of cargo that becomes abandoned because something goes wrong with that shipment in transit. And that's a terrible cost. And how would your terminal cope with that? And who do you go to for assistance? In the UK, if that happened, the UK authorities would step in and help. In this particular port, the authorities said, no, can't move it. In Malta, the authorities said, no, we can't have radioactive shipments inside our terminal at all. So what do? In fact, the Maltese authorities, a couple of years ago, I was out there doing some training, and the US authorities, who of course check every container coming to the US, and they require, before you export a container to the US, you have to take the container through a radiation portal, and they come out every now and again to test your facility to make sure that's working. They tested one in Malta with a known source of radiation inside it. They found it, great, the portal worked. Then they said to the Malta Freeport, well, what happens now? So Malta Freeport said, well, what do you mean? Well, you're going to have to deal with it. What are you going to do? And the Maltese authorities said, no, well, we're not having it. So now you're stuck with a container in the port on a small island. How do you deal with that situation? So Malta Freeport said to me, can we keep it on the ship? Is there something we can fit to the spreader, the crane spreader, so we can detect radiation before we lift it out of the ship? And yes, there are products that do that, but then what do? You've got a ship with an unknown source of radiation inside it. Where does the ship go? So these are things we need to think about. And many countries, of course, won't accept Class 7 cargoes through their territory. So you've got to think about the unintended consequences of positive action. Next slide, please. We know this is not an abandoned cargo. This is a regularly shipped cargo. And and I think next speakers are going to refer to this kind of problem. Charcoal. Charcoal is causing significant problems around the world in terms of ship fires and everything else. And when you start to look at some of the packing procedures, which are displayed here, and no disrespect to the poor gentleman who has to do the job, is there any wonder that sometimes these cargoes fail? This is typically, in some places, how charcoal is packed into containers. and it's a real shame. So if you expect the shipper to comply with the procedures that are inherent under the IMDG code and or the CTU code, as Peregrine mentioned, then it doesn't always happen. Next slide, please. And you don't want this to happen with a container that's been stuck on your terminal or in your vessel for a few years. And I have seen this so many times, more than I've had hot breakfasts. Next slide, please. The costs of cleaning these things up can be astronomical. And as Peregrine touched on, the insurance costs are only part of it. You've got then the costs of damage to your company, management time, the cost of bringing in specialists to clear it up. And in Beirut, of course, they now have a German company in there doing a good job of clearing everything up. And that's where they found out there was lots of abandoned containers as well, not just the ammonium nitrate cargo. So my call to the industry really is to keep accurate records and then check and double check what's physically out there. If something doesn't look right, then there's clearly a problem. My colleagues in Malta, and I'm back there next week in actual fact, discovered that the concrete underneath a set of 3 containers, which looked like they'd been there a long time, the concrete was actually melting. And there was a particular form of acid which had leaked through its big bags, was actually leaking through the container doors onto the floor. And they'd been there for well over 3 years. Get your staff to report anything that's suspicious. Develop clear lines of communication with everybody included in your chain. Ship operator, the shipper, the receiver, the terminal operator, the authorities, the fire and rescue people, and have a plan on how to deal with things when they go wrong. You need to know where to go to get things sorted. I audited a rail terminal in a European country a few years ago, and they had all sorts of obnoxious chemicals coming through the terminal, which were perfectly safe while they're inside their contained tanks and securing. But what if something goes wrong? And they were very close to a school and a housing development within 600 meters in actual fact. And I said to the managing director, how long have you been operating? He said, 40 years. How many times have you had a drill with the fire and rescue service? He said, well, never. I mean, that is a recipe for disaster and in mini Beirut waiting. Thank you very much.